Welcome to Grow Them Right, a podcast where we explore how to prevent health issues from infancy. I'm Dr. Rosh Amrayan, dentist and mother of 2 teenagers, and I have a keen interest in preventative health. Join me each week as I speak with various experts, explore insights, and discuss practical tips as to how we can help our children grow healthy and strong for life. I hope you find this space useful, and if you do, please take a second to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. Welcome to Grow Them Right. Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. I have Ken Ye today with me. He is a clinical physiotherapist and the founder of 4Axis, a movement education space. Ken has a keen interest in prevention of issues, but also a focus on education of his patients about longevity and performance. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Rosh.
So, do you have anything else to add to that introduction, Ken?
No, I think that sums it up quite well. I think I'm always pushing my patients and my clients to perform at their best, but also what is important to them in life.
So, this podcast, Grow Them Right, is about how we recognize issues early on.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we prevent them from getting worse, or better still, prevent them from happening in the first instance? So, from a physio perspective, do you think that we can influence the way our children grow?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that you can influence how your children grow. And I think this is the whole debate on nature versus nurture. I guess the real question becomes, why do you want to influence how your children grow, and what are you trying to achieve out of that influence?
So just to say that, young parents, they've got this new baby. Parenting entails a lot of challenges. There's no manual for it. And they want to make sure that this child grows healthy. In other words, they want to future-proof their child so that, as this child grows, they don't set them up for issues in the future, but set them up for health.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that would be the reason why they should be concerned about it. Any other reasons why they should be concerned about it?
It's really interesting the way you phrase that question, to set them up for health. If that is how we are defining what we should establish for each individual child, then that's fantastic. But I don't think that's necessarily always the case in life. I think there are other factors in life that we're always striving for, whether, we're looking at becoming a professional athlete, or we're looking at a career, or we're looking to become an artist. I think what you're trying to establish is, why do you want to influence how they're growing, or why they're growing, and what the end goal is in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to support that as much as possible.
The big picture, of course, is really, really important. Why do we do this? Why are we concerned about this? Which requires quite a lot of mindfulness on behalf of the parents. But what are some of the practical things that we can see? So can we perhaps talk about milestones?
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about, what happens at each stage from infancy?
The first 7 years of growth, there is so much that happens from infancy through to toddler, through to child and adolescent and beyond. And there is so much that happens through that time frame that it's really hard to break down, just because every child is so different. But we do have those milestones in place so that we can compare against what is typical for other children around the same age. What are some of the helpful tips for different stages of those timeframes or of those stages in life? I think there's a commonality across all of them, and that it's to have an adequate level of stress. You want your children to struggle a little bit, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming that they shut down, and not so much that they're so stressed that they don't have the right conditions to grow. But you don't want them to not struggle at all, or have them so comfortable that they're not forced to grow.
Interesting. So are you saying that a little bit of stress is actually good?
A little bit of stress is definitely good for the child.
Well, and what do we mean by that? What is it, stress on the playground, or is it what do you mean by a little bit of stress?
We can break this down into both mental and physical. As a physio, let's talk about the physical first.
That's right.
And say, for example, your child is somewhere between 6 and 9 months and they're starting to crawl. In order for them to be able to crawl, we have to break this down, and they needed to be able to have some level of head control prior to that. They needed to be comfortable on their tummy prior to that. And if they haven't been able or haven't met those requirements, there's no way that they will be able to crawl. So along those stages, they needed to build an adequate level of head control, which will come in the first few months of life. And then as we start to turn them over or flip them over and they start to roll around, then they start to develop a level of control on their stomach. And that control there builds them up for a level of control in their legs and arms, which then hopefully allows them to resist against gravity and come up onto all fours so that they can start to crawl.
So the same way that we want mental resilience for our kids, we want physical resilience for them as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good way to put it. It's about just giving them the right amount of stimulus or stress so that they are forced to challenge themselves, but not so much challenge that they shut down, but just enough challenge so that they're actually interested and engaging and enjoying the process. And as they enjoy that process, they'll start to challenge themselves a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, over that time frame or over a period of time, they've finally mastered one thing. And then they move on to the next.
Very interesting. The question that I've always been very interested about is, are genetics the whole reason for the way we are and the way we have grown and come to the point that we are? I mean, we know that genetics are blamed for a lot of our issues, but can environmental factors and what we do impact this process? So the trajectory of growth, can it be influenced by what the parents have done or what the family environment has been or what the parents have modeled for these kids or what diet has the family adopted? Can we influence in that sense the way the kids grow?
Yeah, that's another really great question, Rosh. Short answer is yes. I think if we draw the parallel to, say you've got a plant and you wanted this plant to grow, if you sheltered this plant, never gave it any sunlight, never gave it any water, never gave it any care, this plant probably wouldn't grow and will eventually die off. And the same thing happens to the human body. So absolutely, to provide the right environment is then what will allow these children to grow up respective to that environment.
Because you see these trends happening in populations. I've always been fascinated by these uptrends of various things. Like, for example, are we seeing more incidents of things like ADHD, things like autism, childhood diabetes, type 2 diabetes, that is, things like even the rate of adult tonsillectomies. We see that this is on the increase. And I've always wondered, as a society, what is going on that our kids are being diagnosed more and more with various things. Now, I'm not sure if in your field of work, you're seeing similar things at all or not. Are you seeing a lack of mobility in children impacting them in a way that has led to an increased incidence of various issues? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I guess a pertinent question is there a mismatch between our modern day society and what our bodies are capable of dealing with? And I think that's the question you're trying to ask. And correct me if I'm wrong on that one.
No, I think that's spot on. I think that's spot on. I mean, one of your interests, I know, from conversations I've had with you in the past, that you have been interested in how we got to be here.
Yes. Absolutely.
So how did we evolve to this point, and how is our current lifestyle differs
Yes.
from, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution
Yep.
to this last 200 years, and especially to this last 20 years or 30 years?
My generation was one of the first generations to grow up with technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has been a big change for much of the developed world. But we still spent most of our childhood outdoors. The generation below me has grown up with technology from the get-go. And in Australia anyway, while we have the opportunity to go outdoors, we're becoming more and more sheltered indoors. And instead of going to school, finishing school, playing outside until sunset, we're now finishing school, going home, playing on technology
until 1 a.m.
Yeah. Or 1 a.m. And I guess if you really wanted to break this down, if you want to be good at technology, then play with it till 1 a.m. But is this good for us? That's a different question, right? And from a physio perspective or from a movement perspective, I don't think so. We might be really good at using our thumbs, but not necessarily good at using our entire bodies. But at the end of the day, our bodies is ultimately how we interact with the world around us. And if we don't have good control of our body and we aren't confident in our bodies and we can't move well, we can't be confident through life. But we might be confident on a screen because we're built to do that and we're wired to do that from finishing school till 1 a.m.
This is so interesting because I have, as you know, 2 teenagers, and and parenthood is very, very difficult. And it's very difficult to take those devices away from kids these days, right? And one of the reasons why they convinced me when we first got the Xbox was that if they don't have this, or if they don't have the smartphone, they don't have that participation at the school.
Relative to the other children.
That's right. They had to be included at the lunchtime conversations and games, etc. They had to actually be after hours playing with the same peer group. And it was very interesting because you mentioned the other day when we were talking that the whole aim of health and the whole aim of future-proofing ourselves and our kids for life is to be able to participate in life.
Yeah. For the parents, how do we model this for our children? I guess ultimately, at the end of the day, the children are a reflection on the parents. And so if the parent cannot model this, then I don't think that they can expect their children to model the same behavior. I say this because in the physio world, what I see is most people come to the physio because they're in some form of pain. But as a practitioner and as a clinician, I think this extends much further beyond this. Because at the end of the day, while they're in pain, that's a symptom of something bigger than that, and it actually stops them from participating in life. So put it this way, or this is how I would put it. Pain is the symptom that brings people to the physio, but pain is also the barrier that prevents people from building a skill or participating in an activity. So the opportunity to participate in an activity requires them to have minimal barriers, and that is what allows them to build on their skills. And the ability to build on their skills is ultimately what allows them to connect with other people, be invited to go out kayaking, be invited to go out hiking, actually interact with each other and wrestle each other. So it's not necessarily about the pain, but the medical world has been so fixated on the pain, but it extends so far beyond pain, it actually prevents us from interacting with each other. And that's what people care about. What are some of the practical tips and what are the things to look for as children are growing up? I think it's important to preface this answer with it's not a black or white answer, because we have to respect the timeline that occurs as children are growing up.
Yes.
And so a child might not have an issue at 2 years old, but they might actually develop an issue at 4 years old.
Yes.
And so it's not necessarily the case that if your child has a problem at 4, that there was a problem at 2.
Yes.
And so sometimes we can't answer that with, why did this happen in the first place? External environment, external stressors, things happen. You know, you drop your baby on the ground.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. What are some of the practical tips to look for? I think we can sum this up into 2 things. Firstly, is your child interested?
Mm-hmm.
Because for them to be interested, they're engaging.
Yes.
And secondly, is your child struggling an adequate amount where they're not so frustrated? This comes back to that stress point,
Right.
where they're not
They're
so
challenged.
frustrated,
Yes.
but they're also engaged.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want them to
Be bored.
But we don't want them to be too challenged, but we
Yes.
don't want them to be bored,
Yes.
which I appreciate is a very grey answer.
Yes.
But I guess that comes down to the connection that you've got with your child and looking out for these little signs where, you know, they spit the dummy or they throw the tantrum or they just zone out.
And it's interesting because it is so multifactorial. I mean, I always say to mums and dads, my answer to this is a couple of things. One is that, what would the hunter-gatherer do? Right? So like, for example, and you know, and of course there's a lot of evidence for either side of these debates, because a lot of these issues are very, very controversial. And what I find is that parents become really confused because they're getting mixed messaging. Like, for example, do we co-sleep or do we not co-sleep? Like, you know, okay, well, what would the hunter-gatherer do? Would they put their child behind a rock and go back to the campfire? You know, how did we grow to come to this point? Did we have dummies 200 years ago, or did we have blenders, you know, 150 years ago? You know, how did we grow our children in the most natural environment, the way Homo sapiens were? And what did Homo sapien children do? Did they sit behind desks for 6 hours, 7 hours a day, or were they playing in the prairies and in the fields and by the seaside and learning in the context of nature? And now, of course, you know, I'm not saying that people should be, you know, dropping out of school and learning in the forest, but how much connection with our natural environment do we have that allows for that? And again, comes back to your point earlier. What is the barrier to that?
Yeah.
And I just love that question, because sometimes I ask myself this question. You know, I know that eating sugar is bad for me, but what is the barrier for me to, you know, give it up? And I still like to have, you know, that biscuit with my coffee.
Absolutely.
What's the barrier?
Absolutely. I think there are a few different parts to that question, so I'm going to break that question down. On confusion, yeah, absolutely. And social media influences this so much. I mean, we get advice about this and advice about that, and sometimes 2 pieces of advice conflict each other. And, you know, this happens in science and research as well.
All the time.
And so we can find evidence and research to support each different thing.
That's right.
And so the example you gave is, do we co-sleep or do we not co-sleep? And I think it comes down to maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, that was just an example.
Yeah,
it could be a lot of other issues that, you know, there's a debate as to what to do. Which way do we go?
Yeah. And I think that if we're looking back at hunter-gatherers, I mean, they weren't one species that all did the same thing anyway. Some did, some didn't. Some hunter-gatherers in different tribes would have practiced and lived differently to other hunter-gatherers in different tribes, depending on environment, depending on location, availability of food, availability of shelter, or to build shelters. I think that one thing that is universal across all of us now is that, well, in the first world country anyway, is that we've got a roof over our head for the most part. Yes, we do have a homeless population as well, and we have to acknowledge that. But a roof over our head, we've got access to clean water, and we've got access to food.
Yes.
So our environments are fairly uniform, but then, as you said, what are the barriers to growing our children right? Time and effort. Time and effort, which then brings us to a bigger problem. If both parents are working and both parents are working 9 to 5 or overtime, where do they pull this time from? Because there's only 24 hours in a day, and we should be sleeping 8 to 9 of those hours. Which really means that if we are working 8 hours a day, sleeping 8 hours, we're only left with another 8. Factor in the commute time. So if you're living in Sydney, for example, and you're having to commute 2 hours or 1 hour each way, 2 hours total, now you've got 6. And what about the time to shop and the time to cook and the time to do all of these other activities like spend time with your child and wrestle and go out and play and do your washing? All of a sudden, you don't have much time left. So it's a bigger lifestyle question for society than it is just about the children.
It's so interesting because, as you were saying, we've got the material needs covered. Like in Australia, we've pretty much, the middle class is well established. We've got the, shelter, food, access to healthcare, access to education,
Yeah.
But then why is it that we've got probably a higher rate of stress, higher rate of depression? Youth suicide is a big one for me, and then again, it comes back to movement and connection to nature, which then goes back to, can this child participate in activities that require movement, which is so important. If a child can't climb up Mount Lofty because she or he is huffing and puffing and don't have the physical fitness that we should have established much earlier on. I grew up in Iran just after the Islamic Revolution happened, and girls were barred from sports. So I can see the effects of that now. I don't have that fitness that I should have had when we should have been established much earlier, from age probably 5 to 15. And of course there was no opportunity for that, and I still suffer from that. So it's very, very interesting. And I always say to patients, especially when it comes to orthodontic treatment, which is my field, I'm like, have that roadmap ahead so we don't miss the boat on things that we need to become aware of. And perhaps establishing that love for movement is so crucial to be internalized as the children grow.
I agree. On the first point here, you talked about yourself growing up in Iran and not having that baseline built up. And how do we build or establish this love for movement? Somewhere along the line, adults stopped being children. And I think they stopped asking questions and stopped learning by discovery. And they've been zombified into this 9 to 5. So when we start asking questions and we start critically thinking, we start to learn to love ourselves, our body, the world around us. And only then can that be modeled in our children that we raise. So even though you didn't have that baseline growing up in Iran, what's to stop you from doing any of this now? Because that barrier is not there.
Yes. Yeah.
But to go through that level of frustration, I see this time and time again for children to go to swimming lessons. They all throw a tantrum, but we've got our parents to support us. We don't have that as an adult. So it's to get over our own ego, to be frustrated and to be bad at something, but have the mental fortitude and the discipline over and over again, which then makes us competent.
But I think also there's a level of fitness that is established much earlier on. The way your bones, your muscles have grown, the fat cells, for example,
of course,
are established much earlier in life. So those kind of things, again, how do we future-proof the children? I love this point that you just said. Don't forget the child. And so I'm thinking of these moms and dads, and I see them in my office, of course, and they're so stressed. There are, moms especially, because hormones are just going haywire, and they are crying. They're not sure whether they're doing the right thing or not. And they shouldn't forget that the inner child is still there, if they're enjoying it, if they're having fun,
learn to enjoy the
everything's
process
going to be okay.
and not the outcome.
Everything's going to be okay.
And I think the moment you learn to enjoy the process, the outcomes will fall into place.
That's right. It's all about enjoying the journey and not looking too much to the destination.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ken. This was a fascinating conversation.
It's been a pleasure, Rosh.